Hello, BookTube. There are two very major events coming your way in November here on BookTube. Three, if you count our mandatory read-along of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. But leaving that aside for the minute, there are two major things that are coming. One we have been talking about quite a bit on this channel, and we'll continue to talk about quite a bit on this channel, and that's NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, where we take the month to write 50,000 words at the beginning of a novel. And we will deal with that, of course, in due time. But there's another major event on BookTube. 5 years old is pretty old for an internet event of any kind. And that is Nonfiction November, hosted and created by the mighty Olive at A Book Olive. Now, I'm sure by now you've seen her announcement video. And just recently, just today, she posted a fantastic TBR and suggestion video organized around the very general prompts that she has come up with. And as a loyal, due-paying member of Team Nonfiction November, I want to stress what those prompts are. They are designed to be as loose as possible. They are design, sport, true, and voice. As you can tell right there, any amount of creativity will get you around those in no time at all. And in her video, in two videos that she's done so far, Olive has stressed what I want to stress too, which is that those prompts are only that. They are only prompts. The whole goal of Nonfiction November is for you to read more nonfiction. Some if you read none, more if you read some. Olive makes a radical idea. She floats a radical idea in the video that she just posted that I want to float as well. Very much so. I want to float as well. She floats the radical idea that perhaps in November we would read only nonfiction. Well, there's a thought. And I'd already decided myself that I would do that. And that's going to take some juggling on my part. The only exception that I will make is paid work. If I'm being paid to write something, to read a piece of fiction in November, then I will read that fiction in November. That's mercifully for me very rare. I don't think it'll happen probably more than once or twice in the entire course of the month. Other than that, I am shifting around all of my reading to the limited extent necessary in order to get all of November's fiction that I want to read either in October or in December. And that includes the read-alongs that I'm doing on my channel for the Thomas Covenant novels of Stephen R. Donaldson and for the Dune novels of Frank Herbert. I'm going to squish and squash and move things around so that I am not doing anything in November except nonfiction. And I urge you to do the same thing. Submersion is sometimes a wonderful way to get around any kind of reservations you might have about a certain thing. And as Olive points out in her video, there are reservations aplenty about nonfiction on BookTube. BookTube is a fiction-saturated platform. Probably not surprising. Fiction is very inviting. It's very empathetic. And since BookTube was born out of YA, and there's no such thing as YA nonfiction, at least so little of it that it doesn't bear talking about, it stands to reason that fiction reading and discussing and, oozing over would all be in the DNA of BookTube. Nevertheless, well, you all know where I stand on the subject. I have been sort of gently poking fun at the made-up stories for years now on this channel. They can be very involving, very moving, absolutely very personal. They are at heart, though, silly. They are at heart silly. I know that you're probably wondering if I would have the cojones to call Thomas Mann silly to his face. Probably I wouldn't, but I think he's dead. and the point that I'm trying to make is that you have somebody sitting down at a table and saying, okay, well, I'm going to make up a character. Okay, now that I've made up a character, I'm going to make up another character. And this character is going to be different from the first one in, let's see, this way, and this way. And then I'm going to have something else happen. Maybe a safe falls on one of them. And there is an undeniable talent involved that can be brought to bear on that kind of writing. Certainly, I don't mean to be paradoxical, since we will be indulging in that kind of writing for NaNoWriMo. I think it's kind of healthy, in fact, that our little pocket of YouTube here is encompassing both ends of the spectrum, NaNoWriMo and also Nonfiction November. Nonfiction is, I will be talking about, I will be making more videos on the allure of nonfiction, the challenges of it, the rewards of it. But for today, I wanted to, first of all, announce, mention that that in case some of you didn't know, that Olive's announcement videos are up, and that Nonfiction November is bearing down upon us. 2 more weeks until until BookTube's foremost celebration of nonfiction begins. And I wanted also to give you some suggestions for the 4 prompts. Now, keep in mind, the prompts are not necessary at all. As Olive puts it, if you read one work of nonfiction in November, you're part of Nonfiction November. I would suggest that you saturate your reading with nonfiction. The prompts aren't necessary at all to do that, but they are kind of fun to organize the thinking and to make some sort of inroads in the vast amount of nonfiction that's out there. So I thought I would give you 4 suggestions for each prompt. Of books that I wholeheartedly recommend. Some are new, some are old, and all should be available in one way or another. And we'll start with design, the prompt design. And the very first book I want to recommend for design is American Visions by Robert Hughes. It's a large, oversized picture book, at least in America it was printed that way, and it is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It is, on the surface, Hughes's sort of the companion volume to his miniseries of the same title, sort of a view of the development of American art, but it's really about design, and Hughes is brilliant writing about all that sort of stuff. Always was. He is extremely opinionated, but in a bracing, thought-provoking kind of way. And American Visions, at least as I mentioned, the American version of the book. I don't know what overseas versions there were at all. I imagine they were all the same. The American version is gorgeous on its own. Apart from the beauty of the prose, it's saturated with illustrations showing how designs have changed. Buildings designs, city designs, also the aesthetics of art design have changed over the centuries. Just a wonderful book. Probably my favorite of his, even including his collected works of criticism, which we'll get to in my library tour. Then the second book on design that I wanted to mention, something I praised on this channel before. Its author is a heck of a guy. He wrote a heck of a book, and it is about a rather conspicuous piece of design. Something that if you encounter it in nature, you know immediately. It's a weird kind of feeling. You know immediately, if you encounter one of these things in nature, that you are encountering something that is not natural, that was constructed with a large amount of skill and foresight. And yet, if you're in a canoe with a bunch of beagles in the stern, and you encounter that, and that is the very first flash of feeling that you have, this is not natural, your very next realization is unbelievably fascinating, because your next realization is that it's not natural, but it's not man-made. It's in fact a piece of elaborate engineering that is not made by humans. It is, of course, a beaver dam. And the more you study beaver dams, the more you study the structure of them, the building of them from scratch, the more you realize how amazing they are. and of course, once you realize that, you have to extend some of the credit to their makers. As obnoxious as beavers are, you have to extend some of the credit to them. And there is a book. I've recommended it on this channel before. It's by Ben Goldfarb, and it's called Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. If you're able to tell from that title, Goldfarb is interested in the long-term positive effects that beavers have on the whole biome that they create. The specific types of vegetation that grow in a beaver pond that don't grow anywhere else. The drowned trees that remain upright and become a thriving home for all kinds of birds, migratory and stationary, for all kinds of bats, and all the changes that go around there. There have been many, many studies. A beaver dam entering a neighborhood might inconvenience the humans around, but everyone else benefits. And every last aspect of what happens, every single last aspect, is carefully studied by the beavers themselves, anticipated, adapted to. They don't just, dam a river and then improvise. They are extremely good engineers. So I want to recommend that. I want to recommend Eager. Then, when we're talking about design, another design that's very famous that is comparatively recently known is the double helix design of DNA, the essence of who we are. And when you're studying the structure of DNA, of course I'm going to recommend Sid Mukherjee's book, The Gene. Siddhartha Mukherjee wrote a brilliant book called The Gene, which is not just about the human discovery of genetics, step by step, decade by decade, century by century, genius by genius, but also a study of the structure of the design of DNA itself, and how fascinating that is. I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with the gene. It is everything that you've heard it described as. Wonderful, wonderful book. And then the last of the recommendations for design, naturally in certain quarters of YouTube, when you hear the word design, you think about young Earth creationists. You think about in America there's a vast amount of Christians who believe that the Earth is roughly 6,000 years old, that Noah's flood actually happened, and that before Noah's flood, the world and everything in it was created in their current state by sorcery, by a god, by means of sorcery. And that belief, religious people in America have been trying hard to work that into the school systems for 200 years, failing at almost every step of the way in most states in the Union, but trying every single decade to make it possible or even mandatory for schools to teach young students that their world was created by magic. And there are secular groups that always fight that, and that the succession of legal defeats have forced creationists to rebrand their product many times. And what their current rebranding, the current term for all this nonsense is something called intelligent design. The word design is right there in the title. And their idea is that when you look around you at the complexities of the living world, you see things that are too complex to have happened by random chance. That is the first straw man that they always struggle in. They characterize evolution by means of natural selection as quote-unquote random chance. It certainly is not. Anyone who knows anything about it knows that, but nevertheless, they work that in right away into their so-called argument and say, when you look around at trees or giraffes or koala bears or the human eye, you see complexity. Even on the human genetic and cellular level, you see complexity that could not come about by random chance. Things that are irreducibly complex, and you can look and see that they must have been designed by an intelligence. That is as much ground as creationists have been willing to cede. They are now talking about an intelligence. But of course, as many secularists have pointed out over the decades, they know exactly which intelligence they mean, and they would be the first people arguing against these changes to school curricula if you came forward and said, all right, well, I'm president of the school board, and your arguments have won me over. We will now teach intelligent design in the classroom right alongside or in place of evolution. We will teach the young children who come to our school exactly how Lord Brahma did all this. If you had a school board president do that, the intelligent design creationists, these crackpot Christians, would be in the front of the line before the secularists, before the godless atheists. They would be in the front of the line saying, no, you must not teach that. They know which intelligent designer they have in mind. But when you're thinking of intelligent, when the prompt is design, I immediately thought of intelligent design, and that brought up a book that I want to recommend, and I'll write all these down below. The book is by Abby Hafer, and it's called The Not So Intelligent Designer: Why Evolution Explains the Human Body and Intelligent Design Does Not. She restricts herself just to the mess that is our haphazardly evolved human body, to point out there isn't anything here that bears the imprint of an intelligent designer. If you're going to say that any of this was designed intentionally, then it was designed by someone who is either incompetent or sadomasochistic, who hates us. And it's great. There are many books on the subject, but this one's just wonderfully done, so I wanted to recommend it. Then the next prompt is sport, and that is an interesting one for me because I don't play any sports. I don't watch any sports. I'm not interested in sport at all. And yet I have forever, despite those things, I have forever been aware of the fact that sports writing is tremendously good. The subject of sports often brings out the best writing in people. It's why for many years at Open Letters Monthly, I wished that I had someone to write about sports writing, to review it. And now for Open Letters Review, I still wish that I did. I am not in a position to do it. I can comment on the prose, but what good is that if I can't comment on what Julius Erving did 30 years ago? So, but nevertheless, even though I'm not an active, fan of sports, I can very much recommend some sports writing, sports-oriented writing. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 4 recommendations here. The first one is one that I've recommended on this channel many times before. It's Jonathan Eig's biography of Muhammad Ali. Big, thick thing, one of the latest of many biographies of Ali, and yet I love this one. Thought it was fantastic, mainly because it doesn't try to make a saint out of Ali. It tries to make an admirable man out of him. Turns out that's not hard to do, but not a saint. And that's great. That's what I wanted. And when it comes to not making a saint out of your subject, the next one I want to recommend is The Big Fella by Jane Livy, which is her biography of Babe Ruth. And he also has been subject to sort of through the back door, sotto voce hagiography, the type that I just can't stand. And I know this is going to sound a little predictable, but Livy does a wonderful job of bringing out a three-dimensionally textured version of who Babe Ruth was as a person. And I can't help but think that part of that has to do with the fact that she's a woman. I've lost track of how many men writing biographies of Babe Ruth where I've read the biography, I'm 2/3 of the way through, and I'm thinking, okay, what is the vibe that I'm getting here? That you think that you'd like to go to the batting practice with him? That maybe you could outswing Babe Ruth? Is that it? Is there some sort of bat measuring going on here? There's nothing like that in The Big Fella. Instead, it's just a look at him and his history in a way that doesn't read like any other Babe Ruth biography. Even Big Band by Lee Montville is a wonderful book, but this reads better, I think, than any of them. Then the next one I want to recommend is about a sports writer. It's about a sportscaster. It's Why My Wife Thinks I'm an Idiot by Mike Greenberg. I think it might have been his debut. And I don't know anything about the guy. Knew nothing about him whatsoever. I read the book because I liked its premise, which is not only his adventures in sports broadcasting, but also his adventures in the deadliest sport of them all, being a parent, having children, having babies and toddlers running around the house. And his accounts of both of those things are immensely enjoyable. So funny, so self-deprecating. I don't know if he's like that in real life. I have no idea what he's doing now. But I cannot recommend the book strongly enough. I think it was just wonderful. And then the last one I want to recommend is... it harks back in history. Some of you who are young will not have any idea that this ever happened. It's a curiosity of history. I was spellbound, so was everyone else when it was happening. We have to hark back all the way to 1973, when the tennis player Billie Jean King, responding to a tennis player named Bobby Riggs, who went in front of the press all the time as a loudmouth lout, calling himself a male chauvinist pig, and challenging Billie Jean King to a tennis match. He kept saying, a man can beat a woman at anything. That men are better than women. I'm better than any woman. And Billie Jean King was reluctant for a long time to indulge in any of that. Not only because she sensed what a charlatan Bobby Riggs was, but also because she was keenly aware of how devastating it would be if he won. And eventually, they had their match. And many, many books have been written about it. Billie Jean King has written about it in a couple of books. And I want to recommend one of those books to you. It's called A Necessary Spectacle. Billie Jean King, Bobby Riggs, and the Tennis Match That Leveled the Game. It's by Selena Roberts, and it's terrific. Just terrific. I've read, I think, all the major books on that match, and this one beats them all easily. It's just so good. And it's also a thing that really happened. So I wanted to recommend it to you. That's for sport. Then we're going to move on to true. I'm going to try to make this video less than an hour long. So we'll move on to the category of true, which automatically makes you think of true crime. But I want to stress an aspect of this prompt that's a little different from that, which is true in terms of hard truths, in terms of, brilliant reporting that brings hard truths in front of you. Things like that, I think, are as fascinating. Well, that's basically what true crime does. But I think with true crime, there's also an element of voyeurism that I'd like to kind of avoid if I could, except for one category. I have one suggestion here. But the first one is by Naomi Schaefer Riley. I've praised it on this channel before. It's The New Trail of Tears, How Washington is Destroying American Indians. And it's harrowing, just harrowing what reservation life is like, what many, many American Indians face today, what they've faced in the last 30 years. It's stark, it's bleakly but very beautifully written, and it's eye-opening, just eye-opening. Then the next one is a big fat work of history, but it also is eye-opening, and it's by Donald Morris. It's from 1986, When All the World Made Sense. And it's called The Washing of the Spears. Some of you who know your big narrative histories will already know it. It's a terrific book about Shaka Zulu, about the rise of the Shaka nation, about the Zulu nation and the fall of the Zulu nation and the Zulu wars. And it's brutal. Like a couple of these books, it's brutal. It's brilliantly done, though. So I'm going to use this as true. This is the story of the Zulu wars. No one comes out looking well. It's a big book, and no one comes out looking well. So then the next one I want to recommend actually has truth in the title. And this is These Truths by Jill Lepore. Her big, fat, new one-volume history of the United States that originally I worried was going to be preachy. I worried that it was going to be a woke history of the United States, but it is not that at all. Not only is it even-handed in its damnations, but it's also wonderfully written. Those of you who've read Jill Lepore's other books, or you've read her in The New Yorker or whatever, will already know she's a terrific writer. She clearly labors over her paragraphs and sentences until they do exactly what she wants. And These Truths are just full of sentences like that. So These Truths is bound, I think, soon to come out in paperback. It's been a while. It came out last year. I would assume that it will be out in a big, thick paperback in time for the autumn and the so-called serious book buyers. So we'll keep an eye out for it, but I strongly recommend it. All of your libraries will have it. Every library in America has a copy of the book. And then the last one for true is a bit of intrepid reporting that I'm really hoping is true. I don't know if it is or not, but I'm really hoping that it is. It's by Jennifer Toth, and it's called The Mole People. And it's all about the miles and miles and miles of abandoned subway tunnels, abandoned access tunnels, and beneath those, caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. That underneath all of that abandoned understructure of the New York subway system and the New York access system and whatnot, that underneath even that, there are caverns and crevasses leading down to subterranean rivers. And that in all of that space, all of that vast amount of space, humans have migrated and lived. Maybe migrating up to the surface in order to gather food at night and then going back down into the depths, or maybe developing ways to feed themselves down in the depths. And Jennifer Toth tells the story of these mole people, and she gathers a lot of firsthand reportage, people who say, I have seen this, I know, I've been down in those tunnels, I was one of those people, all kinds of stuff like that. I don't know how much of it is true, but oh my God, is it fascinating. Not a single dull page in the book. So I'm going to include it under true, because I hope that it's all true. One of the stories is that way underneath the subways, the abandoned subway tunnels, and way underneath the abandoned access tunnels, there are caverns that are constantly soaked in mist from a river that runs underneath Manhattan and that comes up to ground level at certain points in the island. That cavern runs underground and has carved deep caverns in the bedrock, and that there are people who live on ledges of those caverns over those rivers, who for generations have never come to the surface. One of Toth's witnesses says that those people speak to each other in chirps. That language has fallen away and they've developed a new language. So I'm going to include this under true for wishful thinking, although you read the book yourself and see what you make of it. And then the last category is voice. And one of Olive's suggestions for voice is something that I want to recommend as well. I want to overlap with her just a bit and recommend Voices in the Ocean by Susan Casey. It's all about dolphins. And Olive points out in her suggestion video that it is tough reading. At points, it is tough reading because humans have been brutal to dolphins like they've been brutal to everything else. And the end is also written. You can see it pretty clearly. We are line harvesting the entire ocean. We're emptying it and we're not hunting for dolphins. At least most people aren't. Plenty of nations are, but most people aren't. But it doesn't matter because hundreds of thousands of them are dying in the line nets. The whole point of a line net is that it harvests everything from the ground to the surface along a gigantic swath of ground of area in the ocean. Dolphins just get caught in those and die. They drown. But Voices in the Ocean isn't just depressing, so I want to recommend the whole thing. It is every bit as good as Olive said it was. But then for for a few more voice, there are 2 volumes that I want to recommend that struck me right away. They came to my mind right away for voice because they actually include an audio component. They aren't audiobooks. I'm not recommending any audiobooks, but they have an audio component. They are the Backyard Birdsong Guide by Donald Kroodsma and a bunch of experts. And I'm sure you've seen them in bookstores. They're oversized, and you have a book with pages, you have illustrations and photographs and identification guides and distribution maps and whatnot. But you also have a battery-powered button that you can press per page that will give you the sound of the birds that are being talked about. There's an audio component to the book. You can hear what these birds sound like, under the assumption that a lot of times when you're out and about trekking, even out and about birding, that you will hear birds without seeing them. So there's very much a voice there, and it's tremendously fascinating. And it turns out that you can replace. You don't have to buy another book when that battery wears out. There is a way to keep the thing going. If, for instance, you have kids and they're just playing it endlessly and you're worried, is this going to be a waste of my money? Is the battery going to die out? There is a way to keep it going, although it's so much fun. These books are so much fun that you'll probably want to buy a couple. And then the next one is, in terms of voice, is voices that are captured on the page. And in this case, from people whose voices are the most vulnerable to being silenced, to being not heard, not recorded. And this is a Penguin classic. I've praised it on this channel before. It has stuck in my mind. I go back to it quite a bit. It's the Penguin Classic Portable 19th Century African-American Women Writers volume. It's a bit of a mouthful, but these were writers who are the wretched scum of the earth to begin with. These are women, and these are African-American women. Quite a few of them were born in slavery. And this book collects their writings and gives great thumbnail portraits of who they were and what their times were like, what issues were involved. Just an utterly fascinating book. You all know I'm a big Penguin Classic fan. I like most of what they do. But I'm perfectly willing to admit, every once in a while they hit a real home run. And this book is a real home run. Clearly meant for schools, clearly meant for classes, but don't miss it just because of that. These are people you've never heard of, and they're amazingly eloquent in the face of multiple kinds of silence, of silencing. So I wanted to recommend that under voice. And then the last voice, of course, when I think of voice, I think of opera, my secret passion. I hardly ever talk about it on book 2. And when I think of opera, I think of Beverly Sills. So the last thing I want to recommend for voice and for this video is one of Beverly Sills' memoirs, Bubbles. That was her nickname in the opera industry, was Bubbles. And that book is from 1977, so I'm sure it's never going to be in print again. But if you can find a cheap used copy and you're a fan of opera, I think you'll really like it. It has also quite a bit of digressions on what it's like to preserve this amazing gift that opera singers have. Beverly Sills verges on what a lot of other opera singers whose accounts I've read have done, which is that a lot of times the men, and especially the women, will refer to that gift, their voice, as if it wasn't part of them. It's like, I'm traveling, I've got my secretary, I've got my accountant, I've got my voice. And that is eerie, but after a while you start to sense the truth of it. So I want to recommend Bubbles. I'm never going to get enough a chance to recommend Bubbles by Beverly Sills. I thought I would. And there you go. That's 30 minutes. That is my Nonfiction November video. One of them, the first of them, where I announced the event, in an echo of Olive's videos, but also urge you to join in. This is 5 years. This is a lot of fun. This is celebrating all things Nonfiction November. Olive has set up a Goodreads group that's full of conversation. And I would also urge you, Olive only brought up what she's going to do. I would urge you to take a page from our book. She's doing it. I'm going to do it. And read only nonfiction in November. Table the fiction and just read nonfiction in November. See if you don't get yourself a taste for it. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. This has gone on way too long. Sorry about the length of it. But I'll be back with plenty of other nonfiction videos before we get to Nonfiction November. And then in November itself, you'll scarcely be able to shut me up on the subject. Thank you, Book 2.